Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on what's new in TimelinePI version 3.1. Today's presentation will be delivered by Alex Deibler, who is our Senior Solutions Consultant here at TimelinePI. So let's dive right in. We have just about 30 minutes to cover the following items on the agenda. We'll touch on how to upload your data and get instant analysis on the overview page, process schema, path and cost analysis, and I'm particularly excited about this ROI calculator, and an overview of the knowledge base, that's where to access online help. So I'll turn things over to Alex.
All right, thanks Monique, and hello everyone. As Monique mentioned, my name is Alex Deibler, and I'm a solutions consultant here with TimelinePI. Thank you all for taking the time to join this presentation on the new features which have been released with the 3.1 version of TimelinePI. So Monique did a good job of setting up what we'll be going through today. Let's just jump right into the tool. So we're going to start with the data mapping and upload component. So those of you who are familiar with working in the tool will recognize this screen. There really haven't been any material changes to this area, but I think that it's worthwhile to start here, and we'll show getting some data actually into TimelinePI. So I'm going to browse out to a file that's got some events related data relative to an emergency room process. So we're going to be going through a healthcare use case today, and specifically tracking the flow of patients through an emergency room. So this data is actually a snapshot out of a healthcare provider's Epic system. All right, and I will point out to that file. It's introspected that and actually picked up my mappings from a previous job. But the key being here is that there are 3 fields that are required in order to get started with the tool. The first thing we'll want is a timestamp. That's simply going to tell us when an event has occurred. Next, we'll need a timeline ID, or any kind of a unique identifier that's going to allow us to join together all the events in a given process instance into the same context. So think of something like a customer ID, a patient ID, a claim ID, invoice ID. Really kind of runs the gamut depending on the use case we're looking at. In this example, we're going to be using an encounter ID, which specifically relates to a patient encounter. So when they present themselves to the emergency room, they're given an encounter ID, they go through the process. If they were to come in the next day, they would be given a separate ID, and we would see that as 2 separate timelines essentially within the tool. Now the last required field we'll need would be our event name. That's simply going to tell us the work that was completed at that step. Right? So in this example, we'll see things like triage was started, a lab was ordered, we had a radiology, a patient was roomed, so on and so forth. Now those are the only 3 required fields we'll need. Lastly, we can bring in these fields that you see here mapped in purple that you may consider to be dimensions, ways you want to slice and dice, filter, really give more context to this data by. So for this example, we use things like the day of the week the patient came in on, what was their means of arrival, any comments on the case, and their seriousness by the acuity level score. Now, it's worth mentioning here that these timelines can be assembled from multiple files which are going to correspond to different systems of record. So different events can absolutely come from different sources as long as these different data sources contain this same object identifier, this ID. The tool was smart enough to be able to take those events, connect them together, and insert them into their correct corresponding timelines. And I should also mention that this is the most simplistic way of getting data into TimelinePI. Of course, we could set this up to run on a schedule or in an automated fashion, pulling directly from some data sources. So what we've done is we've mapped these columns in the file. What I would do now is simply hit load and allow the tool to begin reconstituting the process based on these events. I'm not going to waste our time doing that, right? So it would have taken about 90 seconds to load if I had what we have here, which is roughly 500,000 events related to these patient encounters. And in that time, the tool is going to reverse engineer the process, build out all the models, and create the multiple forms of analysis that you're going to see us go through. So let's move into the overview screen. Once we've got successfully data loaded into the tool, we'll be presented with the overview page, which you can see contains quite a few metrics about our emergency room process and the data that we've uploaded. All right, so the first thing I'll mention, almost 450,000 events came out of that file and was mapped into 23,472 timelines. In this case, a timeline is going to be synonymous with a patient encounter. Now, it pulled out 46 different types of events from that data. I won't get too far into the details here, but you can see some of the other metrics we've got, the average and the total range of duration. So on average, it takes us 5 hours to process a patient, but it could be anywhere from 0 to 35 days. The number of events in a patient instance, and actually these two metrics here are brand new in our 3.1 release. The total cost for the population of all of our patients. So what does it cost us as a provider to process these patients? And then the average cost per patient. And we can see the range as well. All right, and we'll get more into this cost information a little bit later in the presentation. The last event, just to touch on, is the first event and last event. Essentially, which events have most commonly both started and finished this emergency room process, and you can get a bit deeper into it and take a look at the full list of the different events which have ended this emergency room process and a frequency breakdown of all of those as well. All right, so from here, let's move into the schema editor. Now, this is going to give us the capability to visually map that most common path through our emergency room process. Okay, and then I'll create a new schema and let you see exactly how that's done. So I'll first start by allowing the software to take what it believes to be the most important milestone events. Now, when I click Select Default Milestones, what's happening here is that the tool is using advanced statistical analysis, specifically picking which events are most reliably and commonly occurring at the same points of the process. So it looks like it picked out 9 milestone events for us that are most typically happening at the same place in the workflow. That's great. We have some others that I'd like assigned as well. So let's add to this model where the decision to admit is made and maybe where a provider is assigned. Okay, so I've added just a couple more, and let's have it generate the default schema for us. So this is showing us that most common schema based on the milestones, which I've essentially said that I care about. Okay, and the nice thing here is that this is not just a Visio diagram. If I choose to save this, it can now become a monitoring tool. Okay, so it's showing us what number of cases have followed which paths relative to one execution path versus another. You can see on the thickness of the lines telling you more transitions have happened relative to another transition. Right, so that's based on the volume of patients going one way versus another. Or we can take a look at it by the amount of time spent in between these steps. So if I change the metric here, you'll see everything will change, and now I've got thickness of the lines represented by the average duration that it takes to go from one step to another. Okay, and I can mouse over and get statistics, as you can see. Now, what's new about this process schema is the ability to animate this and actually take a look in real time to see exactly where our patients are going and maybe where things are backing up. So let's choose to play this timeline animation. Now, what you're going to see is everything. Now all these circles represent patients, of course, going through the process. You'll see where things start to slow down, right? And maybe things back up and start to bottleneck a bit. As things change color, this is showing patient aging, right? So they're actually spending a longer time in the emergency room. Now, if I pause this and I notice anything that's kind of out of sorts or that's a little bit interesting, for instance, this one patient that kind of sits out here and is moving relatively slowly, I can actually click in to that specific patient detail and get all the timeline level information about exactly what's happened with this patient, in what order, who was our provider, right, and all the different interesting attributes that you would want to look at based around this patient encounter. Okay, so not only can we start to see things kind of building up and bottlenecking here, and I'll turn this back on so we can take a look at it just run, but we can also see where things are starting to get older in the process, right? So if we have a directive to, fix what the non-efficient areas of the process, this might be showing us specific sections where we can start to focus and pinpoint in on that. Okay. So from this schema, now we have kind of a general understanding of the process, and using that animation, we can see where things might be going awry or backing up. Let's move into the cost configuration, because we'll be looking at our path analysis from here and the frequency distribution. But I think it makes sense to show you exactly how we configure the cost analysis. So let's take a look at that. So at a high level, there's really two ways of configuring costs, and that's either by specifying a fixed cost for an event or making it based on time. So we can take a look at examples of each. So we've got a patient transferred, for example, event. Each time we transfer a patient, we're saying it's going to cost us a fixed amount of money, right? Each time we do it, we know exactly what the cost is going to be. So I'll just show you how that's done. So we've chosen that the event is patient transferred, and there's a fixed cost of $47.42 all in, right? Keeping the lights on and paying all the employees. This is how much it costs for us to transfer a patient, right? So each time we see that event, that cost is going to be allocated to that. And you see we can also take a cost from an attribute in the data that you've got, if you've got a field that has cost information, or we can create a lookup table and reference an external table or source to bring in that cost detail. Okay, so that's doing it via a fixed cost. We can also look at a time-based cost. So a triage started, for example, would be something that you probably would be more based on the amount of time it takes to do the actual triage. So let's take a look at that. So you can see we've got a time-based cost based around our triage started, and what we've defined here is the time basis is based on a specific subsequent event occurring. So this is when we'll essentially turn the timer off on this event. And what we, of course, has specified as our ending event is triage completed. So what is the delta of time in between triage started and triage ending? And then what we've done is said, well, let's apply a $15.96 hourly rate, right? Should it take an hour, that's how much it would cost, but a fraction of that, of course, if it takes less. That's how much it costs per hour to do a triage in between the triage started and triage completed event. Right? Now we could also specify that any subsequent event after triage completed, let's turn off the clock and say we've ended that event, or pick a second timestamp attribute out of our data set. So if we had a second timestamp in our data, we could take that field and we would calculate the difference between those two timestamps. All right. So those are, at a high level, as I mentioned, are the two ways to input cost information into the system. Let's go back and take a look at exactly how you would realize that in the path analysis and start to get a look at exactly how much these different patient flows are costing us. So when I open up path, you'll now notice this may look familiar, right? It's the same type of a model. It's a frequency distribution of all the different possible ways that this ED process has been executed. It's got our most commonly followed path here to the left with our events here along the left, and you can see essentially 956 patients have taken this path through our ED. So again, you're going to clearly see here where it's going to expose when we skip steps, go back to complete steps, repeat steps, which of course is going to drive up our cost, right? And if you scroll to the right, there's more and more interesting and obscure kind of ways that this process has been executed. But I think what we're most interested here is differentiating this cost. So you see, this is actually new here. This second level of metrics we've got. We can see both on average, how long is it taking us to process a patient one way versus another. So based on time efficiency, but we can also hit this drop down and take a look at it by cost. So let's look at the average cost of taking one path versus another, right? And so we can see our most common path, which is really only 4% of the time, costs us $112.34. And there's any number of different variations here. So what the idea here is to try to push to your most compliant, first of all, and most cost-effective paths, because those are going to be the behaviors that are going to give you, the most efficient return on all the work that's being done in the ED. So we can look at the average cost per one of these paths. There's other metrics here too, like the total cost. So the cost times the number of timelines that have actually executed on that path. How much is this execution path costed us specifically in total and down the line? And likewise, the average number of events, duration, counted timelines. So all these cost metrics are really allowing us to now push and drive towards a more efficient way of completing this process relative to the bottom line of our organization. Now, another form of analysis that we can take advantage of having this cost information is the ability to filter and scope our timelines by how much they cost. So let's take a look at that. When we'll go into our timelines view, and what I'll do is I'll click on this average cost metric. This is going to show me a histogram relative to all of my patient encounters and how it skews by their cost. So I can see the minimum is nothing, right? The average is $131 per patient, and the maximum could be $511. So what I can do is skew this threshold and start to take a look at, let's say we're interested in analyzing patients which have cost us over $198. Now it's only 7% of our entire population, but that's still almost 1,650 patients which have cost between $198 and $511. Now let's apply this as a filter. Now we're looking at just those 1,648 patient encounters which have cost us over $198, and now we can start to drill in and take a look at things like root cause. Where and when and why is this actually occurring? Where are these? Are there any trends in the data that allow us to point towards where they're most commonly occurring, these high expense patient encounters? And we can use the breakdown mechanism to do that. So we can break it down by let's say, the means of arrival or the day of the week, and see if there's anything that stands out. That's a relatively even distribution there, day of the week. But actually, when we look at the different lab tests that are done, which is actually lab data is contained in this comments field, we can see here that there is a lab test that looks like it's a large slice of the pie. So maybe we need to understand and go ask questions of the lab exactly why it's either taking us so long or is it so costly when we're running this specific lab. Right? But really any of those different attributes that we load that are going to allow us to drill in and try to take steps to mitigate these expensive patients from happening, if at all possible. Okay, so from here, let's transition and take a look at the website. So we'll transition out of the tool. We've taken a look at some of the new functionality that's been added with version 3.1 of TimelinePI, but I want to take a look at our new website and knowledge base area. So let's click over to there. So if you come in via the general site, TimelinePI.com, this is going to be the new look and feel of the website. So there's a lot of good information here relative to the product, some of the different industries that we've got experience in servicing. Let's take a look at some of the resources that we've got out there. So we've got a number of different data sheets, whether they're generic to the tool or specific to an industry vertical. Some recorded demos here for you to actually browse, and if you're interested in kind of drilling a bit further into a specific part of the tool, you can certainly come and skip through and take a look at the demonstration around that. But let's take a look at our support and our knowledge base. So knowledge base is going to be under the support header. And what we've done here is put a number of headers together to make this a little bit easier to navigate. So our getting started is going to relate to mostly loading data into the tool, connecting the data sources, and then the subsequent analysis you're going to immediately get upon loading data, right? So your overview page explaining what a timeline is. I'll show you our data upload knowledge base article as an example, right? So we've got some mapping examples, a sample file, the common issues you may come across when loading data, and we've also got an example video demonstration that's going to walk you through specifically mapping your data and loading it into the tool. So some of the other headers we've got here, all the different analysis tools have their own breakdown. So if you're curious, the first time you come in, there's so many different things that you can do to explore the data. These are going to be really helpful to give you a good feel on, where do I start? Do I go into path? Do I start to build out queries? How can I input costs, dimensions and breakdowns, dashboarding, and all those types of things will be really, really helpful once you start drilling into the data. We've also got some other features and functions that relate to alerts, tagging timelines, setting icons, and building out sets. So this will become really, really useful as you get a little bit more mature with using the tool. And then lastly, of course, some administrative features. Setting up users, sharing project, the details of your projects, authentication, and then our data manager utility, which is a separate utility that can be installed on the client side. So this is all here to help you as you kind of grow with the product, and this knowledge base itself will be growing. More sample videos are going to be added over time. The more we add to the product, the more this is going to be built out. So be sure to check back here for any updates. And so with that, I'm going to close out the demonstration portion of the webinar. Again, thank you all very, very much for the time today. And please feel free to reach out to us directly at support@timelinepi.com with any questions or further requests. So Monique, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you, Alex, for a great presentation on the new features in this new release. And thanks to everyone for joining today's session. You will receive a recording of today's presentation in a follow-up email. And please feel free to reach out to us with any questions or comments about the product. Have a great day.